Dawn breaks over Narrai Nala as mist seals the narrow gorge. The Satpura forest is silent. Below, a large invading force struggles forward, compressed by rock and slope, its artillery lagging behind, its advantage delayed by the land itself. At the front stands the commander, mounted on the war elephant Sarman. She is not a Mughal general. She is Rani Durgavati. In an age ruled by empires and cannon, she chooses terrain, discipline, and honor. Before Narrai Nala became a place of final reckoning, Rani Durgavati's name had already traveled far beyond the forests of Gondwana, not as legend, as record. 51, some say 52 engagements. Raids, sieges, counterattacks, punitive campaigns, different terrains, different enemies, different stakes. One pattern held. She did not lose. This matters because Gondwana was not supposed to survive this long. It was a forest kingdom, rich in iron, timber, elephants, and revenue, but surrounded by powers that measured strength in cities taken and artillery counted. To the north and west, the Mughal Empire expanded with administrative precision. Provinces fell not because they were weak, but because resistance was expensive. Most rulers learned the rule quickly. Submit early, keep your title, pay tribute, live. Durgavati did not. Her refusal was not theatrical. It was systematic. No oath of loyalty, no annual tribute, no ceremonial submission at a Mughal court. Gondwana would not become a buffer state or a feeder of resources. It would remain sovereign, defended not by walls, but by movement, by forests that swallowed columns, by hills that broke formations, by commanders who understood that survival against empire required thinking differently about war. The decision carried immediate consequences. Raiding parties tested her borders. Neighboring states watched closely, calculating when Gondwana would fold. It didn't. Each probe was answered. Each incursion met resistance that cost more than it gained. Over time, something unusual happened. The cost-benefit logic of conquest began to tilt. Gondwana was no longer an easy prize. It was work. Durgavati's reputation grew not because she declared it, but because others repeated it. Merchants spoke of protected routes. Chiefs spoke of campaigns that failed. Mughal officers noted delays, losses, refusals that did not resolve. In central India, her name began to circulate with a specific meaning. This queen fights. But here is the deeper promise her story makes. These victories were not accidents of bravery. They were outcomes of preparation. Administration was tightened. Revenue was redirected toward defense. Forest economies were militarized. Iron for weapons, timber for fortifications, elephants for shock and command. This was not resistance as impulse. It was resistance as system, and systems attract attention. For an empire, prolonged autonomy is a challenge to legitimacy. If one ruler refuses and survives, others may follow. Durgavati's success created a problem larger than Gondwana itself. It suggested that Mughal expansion was not inevitable everywhere. That terrain, leadership, and refusal could still redraw the map. This is why her story cannot end quietly. A ruler who wins 50 battles without surrender does not fade away. She forces a response. She draws the gaze of power. The confrontation at Narrai Nala was not sudden. It was the logical endpoint of a long defiance. When the Mughal governor finally moved with full intent, it was not to test her strength. It was to erase the exception she represented. This is her story. Not of rebellion, but of sustained sovereignty. Not of a single battle, but of a long refusal to accept the rules written by empire. By the middle of the 16th century, the Mughal Empire had learned how to expand without chaos. Conquest was no longer only a matter of battlefield victory. It was administration, taxation, and the steady absorption of land into a system that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. After the fall of Malwa, Mughal authority pressed south and east toward regions that had once survived by being difficult, distant, or divided. Gondwana lay directly in that path. Stretching across the forested highlands of central India, Gondwana was not a single city or fortress, but a resource zone. Iron deposits fed weapon production. Dense forests supplied timber. Rivers and elephant routes connected interior regions to trade networks moving toward the Ganges basin. Control of Gondwana did not promise immediate glory, but it guaranteed long-term stability for any empire that held it. This made the region dangerous in a different way. It was a buffer between Mughal provinces and rival powers that still contested influence across the subcontinent. To the west and north lay the remnants of Malwa's political order. To the east, Bengal's wealth and military traditions remained formidable. The Suri legacy still lingered in memory and practice. Gondwana sat between them all, absorbing pressure from every direction. Most such regions adapted by choosing a patron. They accepted tributary status, sent hostages, or married into imperial families. The logic was clear. Survival meant alignment. Autonomy was negotiable only until an empire required clarity. Gondwana refused that clarity. Under Durgavati's rule, the kingdom did not present itself as a frontier to be managed. It behaved like a core power with its own strategic priorities. Roads were defended, not surrendered. Forest routes were controlled, not opened. Military actions were proactive, not reactive. This was not how buffer states behaved, and it disrupted the assumptions of those who planned imperial expansion. From the Mughal perspective, this posed a structural problem. Empires depend on predictability. Tribute must arrive on time. Borders must remain quiet. Local rulers must enforce imperial order on behalf of the center. Gondwana did none of this. Its continued independence created friction in supply lines, uncertainty in taxation, and an example that could not be easily explained away. Yet the Mughal response was not immediate annihilation. Expansion followed rhythm. Governors assessed cost. Campaigns were prioritized where returns were highest. For a time, Gondwana remained a tolerated anomaly, watched but not yet crushed. Its forests were difficult. Its armies did not seek open field battles. Its ruler showed no interest in negotiation. That tolerance had limits. As Mughal power consolidated across north and central India, anomalies became liabilities. Regions that had once been optional now mattered. Control of trade routes meant control of revenue. Control of forests meant control of materials essential to war. Gondwana's position shifted from peripheral to strategic without changing its own behavior. This is the trap Durgavati faced. She had not provoked empire by aggression. She had done something more dangerous. She had demonstrated that empire could be delayed. In imperial systems, delay is defiance. It forces attention. It demands resolution. By the early 1660s, Gondwana was no longer just a kingdom resisting absorption. It had become a question Mughal authority needed to answer, not for its wealth alone, but for the precedent it set. An autonomous ruler, female or otherwise, who governed effectively and refused submission undermined the narrative of inevitable expansion. The collision that followed was not a clash of personalities. It was a collision between two logics of power. One sought uniformity and control. The other depended on terrain, adaptation, and refusal. Narrai Nala was where those logics finally met. Rani Durgavati was born in the year 1524, within the walls of Kalinjar Fort. The stone citadel rose from the Bundelkhand Plateau as both refuge and warning. Kalinjar had resisted sieges for centuries. It had seen dynasties come, attack, and withdraw. To be born there was to inherit a memory of endurance before learning its language. She belonged to the Chandela lineage, a Rajput house known less for courtly display than for architectural ambition and stubborn independence. The temples of Khajuraho were their legacy, carved in stone when others built in haste. But the Chandelas were also remembered for something less ornamental. They had fought invaders long after retreat would have been safer. Their power had declined, but their traditions had not disappeared. For a daughter of this house, expectation was narrow. Rajput women were raised with discipline and pride. But leadership was symbolic. Queens preserved lineage. They did not command armies. Their authority ended where the battlefield began. Durgavati's life moved against that expectation early. From childhood, her education diverged from the ornamental path. She learned to ride, not as ceremony but as control. She trained with the bow and sword, not as spectacle but as practice. Hunting was not recreation, it was instruction. Reading terrain, anticipating movement, deciding when to strike and when to wait. These were not skills meant for display in court. This training mattered because it rewired possibility. When authority later demanded a commander, she did not need to invent competence. It was already there. The stakes of her life were shaped by contradiction. By birth, she belonged to a Rajput world that prized honor, lineage, and martial reputation. By geography, she would rule in Gondwana, a region defined by forests, tribal networks, and resource economies that imperial courts often misunderstood. She stood between two systems that rarely trusted each other. This position carried risk. Rajput legitimacy did not automatically translate into Gond authority. Gond rulers were powerful in their own right, accustomed to autonomy and local control. To lead them required more than pedigree. It required proof. Her marriage would later formalize this tension, but even before that union, the problem was visible. Durgavati was not being prepared to inherit a throne. She was being prepared to survive a world that did not expect her to rule. The deeper barrier was gender. In 16th century India, female sovereignty existed, but it was conditional and often temporary. A woman might govern as regent, not as commander. She might issue decrees, not battlefield orders. To cross that line invited scrutiny, resistance, and doubt. Durgavati crossed it anyway. The decision to train her as a warrior did not guarantee power. It created risk. If she failed, her failure would be remembered as evidence that she never should have tried. If she succeeded, her success would still be questioned, attributed to advisors or circumstance. This is what sharpened the stakes of her story. She could not merely rule competently. She had to rule visibly, decisively, and under pressure. Each campaign would be judged twice, once by enemies, once by those watching for reasons to deny her authority. Kalinjar had taught her the first rule of endurance. Walls alone do not protect you. Preparation does. Everything that followed grew from that lesson. Durgavati's formation as a ruler did not begin with a coronation. It began with repetition. Days structured around physical endurance, weapons practice, and exposure to environments where hesitation carried cost. This was not education designed to impress a court. It was designed to function under strain. In Rajput households, martial training was woven into daily life, but rarely extended to daughters beyond form. For Durgavati, form was not enough. Riding drills emphasized control at speed, not posture. Archery was practiced from moving mounts, not fixed ground. Sword work focused on stamina and recovery. The ability to continue after mistakes rather than the elegance of a single strike. Hunting provided the most important instruction. Forests did not reward hierarchy. They punished noise, impatience, and misjudgment. Tracking required reading signs that were easy to miss and impossible to ignore once understood. Decisions were made without counsel, often under uncertainty. These conditions mirrored war more closely than any ceremonial drill. Court life offered a different challenge. Rituals enforced order, but also constraint. For a young woman expected to navigate palace norms, participating in military exercises risked social friction. Each appearance in training grounds questioned what her role was meant to be. Durgavati did not retreat from that tension. She absorbed it. What emerged was a hybrid competence. She understood hierarchy, but she did not depend on it. She respected ritual, but she was not bound by it. This balance would later define her command style. Orders were clear. Expectations were explicit. Performance mattered more than status. The training also produced a particular way of thinking about power. Instead of viewing authority as inherited, She treated it as conditional. Command existed only as long as it was effective. This mindset discouraged complacency and rewarded preparation. It also created loyalty. Soldiers followed leaders who demonstrated skill, not just rank. By the time she reached adulthood, Durgavati had internalized a battlefield logic that few rulers ever acquired firsthand. She could assess terrain quickly. She recognized when formations were vulnerable. She understood fatigue, fear, and momentum as forces as real as weapons. This mattered when circumstances shifted abruptly. When authority later fell into her hands, there would be no period of adjustment, no apprenticeship, no time to learn command while protected by others. Gondwana would face immediate pressure from rival chiefs and external powers. The margin for error would be thin. Her earlier training ensured one critical advantage. She did not need to prove herself to herself. Doubt did not consume time. Decisions came from familiarity, not improvisation. In moments of crisis, she relied on muscle memory as much as intellect. This competence also altered how others perceived her. Advisors learned that her questions were informed. Commanders understood that excuses would not survive scrutiny. Even those skeptical of her authority recognized her ability to judge outcomes. Training, in this sense, was not preparation for war alone. It was preparation for resistance, against norms, against expectations, and later, against empire. By the time marriage and rule reshaped her position, Durgavati was not stepping into power untested. She was carrying into it a discipline already forged. The skills that had once been unconventional would soon become essential. What remained was to decide how that discipline would be deployed. The marriage of Durgavati in the year 1542 was not arranged for romance or ceremony. It was a strategic alignment. Dalpat Shah, heir to the throne of Garhamandla, ruled a Gond kingdom rich in resources but vulnerable in legitimacy. The Gonds commanded forests, elephants, and revenue. Yet they lacked the Rajput lineage that neighboring powers recognized as martial authority. The Chandelas faced a different problem. Their prestige remained, but their territorial power had diminished. Alone, neither house could resist the pressure building across central India. Together, they formed a structure that could. This union rewrote the balance of power in Gondwana. Rajput cavalry brought speed, discipline, and battlefield doctrine shaped by centuries of conflict. Gond forces contributed elephant corps, forest infantry, and an intimate understanding of terrain that outsiders could not replicate. The Satpura ranges became more than a defensive backdrop. They became an integrated element of strategy. Durgavati's role in this alliance was not passive. She did not function as a symbolic bride bridging two cultures. She became the connective tissue of command. Fluent in Rajput martial tradition and adaptive to Gond realities, she translated between systems that rarely cooperated smoothly. The decision carried risk. Cultural integration is slow, and war does not wait. Gond chiefs were accustomed to autonomy. Rajput officers expected hierarchy. Friction was inevitable. Durgavati addressed it directly. Authority was assigned based on competence. Command structures were clarified. Loyalty was tied to outcome, not origin. This approach produced results quickly. When Dalpat Shah died unexpectedly in 1550, the kingdom faced collapse. Succession crises invite intervention, and Gondwana's neighbors watched closely. The heir, Veer Narayan, was still a child. By convention, the kingdom should have fractured or submitted. It did neither. Durgavati assumed the role of regent without apology. There was no pretense of temporary stewardship. Orders continued. Campaigns were planned. Revenue collection did not falter. Military readiness increased rather than diminished. This moment established a rule that would define her reign. Power was not inherited through gender or age. It was exercised through stability. Her regency was marked by consolidation. Administrative systems were tightened to ensure consistent supply to the army. Forest economies were reorganized to support sustained mobilization. Iron production was expanded. Elephants were trained not just for shock, but for command platforms and rapid redeployment. Externally, this consolidation sent a clear signal. Gondwana was not weakened by transition. It was hardened by it. Neighbors tested the borders. They were repelled. Internal challengers questioned her authority. They were removed. Each response reinforced the same message. Leadership had not paused because a woman ruled. It had accelerated. The alliance forged by marriage had evolved into something more durable than kinship. It had become a system, one that combined legitimacy, resources, and military coherence in a way few regional powers achieved. This system would soon be tested at scale. Success invited scrutiny. Stability invited challenge. By choosing command instead of concealment, Durgavati placed herself directly in the path of those who measured power by conquest. The rules were set. The game had begun. By the early 1550s, Durgavati's regency had moved beyond survival. It entered a phase of expansion and enforcement that reshaped Gondwana's political landscape. Stability was no longer enough. To remain autonomous, the kingdom needed momentum. The first threats came from within. Chandra Shah, a Gond noble with a rival claim, sought to fracture the regency by exploiting the heir's youth. His challenge was not merely personal. It represented an older pattern, local chiefs asserting independence whenever central authority appeared vulnerable. Durgavati responded without hesitation. The revolt was suppressed, and Chandra Shah was removed from the political field entirely. The message was unambiguous. Succession would not be negotiated through force. External pressure followed quickly. Malwa's remnants probed Gondwana's western borders. Suri-aligned forces tested northern routes. Bengal's influence crept through trade corridors. Each incursion was met not with defense alone, but with retaliation. Raids disrupted supply lines. Forts were reinforced or reclaimed. Border chiefs were compelled to choose sides. This sequence created an escalation loop. Every victory increased confidence. Every response refined capability. Gondwana's army became more cohesive with each campaign, its commanders hardened by experience rather than ceremony. Losses were studied, tactics adapted. Terrain knowledge was institutionalized, not left to individual memory. Durgavati's leadership style drove this acceleration. She did not delegate war to generals and retreat into ceremony. She remained present in decision-making, setting objectives and limits with clarity. Battles were not fought for spectacle. They were fought to enforce political outcomes, compliance, retreat, or elimination of threat. Administration evolved alongside warfare. Revenue systems were adjusted to support continuous mobilization. Taxes were redirected toward arms production and troop maintenance. Forest communities were integrated into logistics networks, providing intelligence, supplies, and mobility. War ceased to be an event. It became a condition. The result was a remarkable record: 51 engagements, by some counts 52, without decisive defeat. These were not identical battles. Some were skirmishes. Others were sieges or rapid counterattacks. What unified them was outcome. Gondwana held. Gondwana advanced. Gondwana remained unconquered. Reputation followed structure. Neighboring rulers recalibrated their approach. Merchants adjusted routes to account for security under Durgavati's protection. Even Mughal administrators took note, recording delays and resistance where submission had been expected. Gondwana acquired a new identity in regional politics. It was no longer a forest kingdom waiting to be absorbed. It became what contemporaries called a golden gourd, rich, intact, and difficult to crack without spilling cost everywhere. This visibility carried danger. Success invites attention from those who can afford to be patient. Empires tolerate resistance until resistance threatens precedent. By proving that sustained autonomy was possible, Durgavati elevated Gondwana from obstacle to example. Examples cannot be allowed to persist indefinitely. The escalation loop that had secured her rule also narrowed her options. Retreat would undermine years of consolidation. Submission would negate the logic of every victory. The only viable path forward was continued resistance, even as the scale of threat grew. By the time Mughal interest sharpened into intent, Gondwana was already committed, not to rebellion, but to a system that could not easily be dismantled without violence. The question was no longer whether conflict would come. It was when, and at what cost. The Mughal response arrived in the form of Asaf Khan. He was not a raider or a border commander. He was a governor with a record. Recently victorious in Rewa, he had demonstrated both military competence and political ambition. Gondwana represented opportunity, wealth to be claimed, resistance to be erased, reputation to be expanded. The force he assembled reflected imperial confidence. 10,000 cavalry, supported by infantry and artillery crews trained in Ottoman gunnery traditions. Heavy guns moved slowly, but their presence changed the rules of engagement. Against cannon, terrain could delay, but not decide. At least in theory. Gondwana's situation was less secure than its reputation suggested. Years of campaigning had dispersed forces across wide territory. Garrisons protected borders. Field units were in motion. When Asaf Khan advanced, Durgavati could not concentrate her full army in time. Worse, intelligence suggested internal betrayal. Routes were compromised. Signals failed. By the time Mughal forces reached the approaches to Narrai Nala, Durgavati commanded only a fraction of her strength. Roughly 500 remained at her side, elite troops, loyal, experienced, and insufficient by conventional measure. She chose to fight anyway. Narrai Nala was not an accidental battlefield. It was a narrow gorge where elevation and vegetation limited movement. Cavalry formations compressed. Artillery lagged behind. Numbers lost coherence. Durgavati understood that empire fought best when it could deploy in space. She denied it that space. Mounted on her war elephant, Sarman, she led the advance into the gorge. This was not symbolic presence. Elephants served as command platforms, rallying points, and shock units. From height came visibility. From visibility came control. The first day favored Gondwana. Mughal units entered the pass in extended formation, their momentum broken by the terrain. Gond forces struck from concealment, exploiting confusion and choke points. Losses mounted. Progress stalled. By nightfall, Asaf Khan's army had been forced back from its intended advance. This mattered far beyond casualty counts. It proved that imperial force could be checked, even when outnumbering its opponent. It validated years of Durgavati's doctrine. Terrain could still discipline empire, but victory on the first day did not end the threat. Asaf Khan adapted quickly. He withdrew to reassess, securing higher ground beyond the gorge. Artillery crews were brought forward under protection. The logic of empire reasserted itself. Durgavati faced a narrowing window. Her forces had inflicted damage, but they could not sustain prolonged engagement against cannon. The advantage of surprise was gone. The Mughal army would not make the same mistake twice. The confrontation had reached its critical phase. What had begun as resistance now became a test of choices. Whether to withdraw deeper into forest, whether to attempt annihilation, whether to accept a kind of victory that did not look like triumph. The first day at Narrai Nala had delayed empire. The second would determine what delay was worth. The night after the first engagement at Narrai, Nala offered a narrow opening. The Mughal army had been checked, not broken. Its losses were real, but its structure remained intact. Artillery units were vulnerable in transit. Cavalry required space it did not yet have. For a brief moment, initiative still belonged to Gondwana. Durgavati understood the equation clearly. Defensive success would not hold once the guns were deployed. If the cannons fired freely, the gorge would become a killing ground. Delay favored empire. Decisive action had to come before dawn. She proposed a night assault. The plan was direct. Strike the artillery camps while they were still being positioned. Disrupt command. Destroy guns before they could dictate the field. It was not a reckless idea. It aligned with everything Gondwana had done successfully for years. Mobility, surprise. The proposal was rejected. Senior commanders objected on grounds that had little to do with strategy. Night attacks were considered dishonorable. Victory, in their view, required visibility. They believed the enemy, already shaken, would falter again at first light. Tradition outweighed calculation. This refusal marked a turning point. By choosing to wait, Gondwana surrendered the initiative. Asaf Khan did not. Throughout the night, Mughal units secured the surrounding high ground. Artillery was hauled into firing positions. Infantry screened the batteries. By dawn, the battlefield had been transformed. When fighting resumed, the logic had inverted. The gorge that had once restricted Mughal movement now confined Gond defenders under fire. Cannon shot shattered formations. Cover disappeared. Elephants, once assets, became targets. Durgavati adapted as much as circumstances allowed. She shifted formations, ordered countercharges, and attempted to disrupt gun crews. Her son, Veer Narayan, led repeated attacks with a small contingent, striking exposed units and withdrawing before annihilation. These maneuvers inflicted localized damage and bought time. But time no longer worked in Gondwana's favor. Each volley reduced numbers. Each hour narrowed options. The battle ceased to be about victory and became about preservation, of leadership, of continuity, of memory. Durgavati recognized this shift and acted accordingly. She ordered Veer Narayan to withdraw. The command was absolute. Protect the air. Preserve the line. This was not retreat as defeat. It was retreat as succession. Gondwana could survive a lost battle. It could not survive the loss of its future. Veer Narayan resisted at first, but obedience prevailed. The young prince disengaged with a small guard, carrying with him the possibility of continuation. Durgavati remained. What followed was not collapse, but controlled resistance. Gond units continued to fight, absorbing pressure, preventing immediate pursuit. Each action traded ground for time. Leadership was no longer about command of the field. It was about choosing what would endure. By midday, the outcome was clear. Empire had imposed its terms. Artillery had decided what courage could not reverse. The pivot had been made. The battle was no longer about defeating Asaf Khan. It was about defining how Gondwana would be remembered when defeat arrived. The second day at Narrai unfolded under fire. Mughal artillery now commanded the field, its range reaching into spaces that had once offered protection. The gorge amplified the impact. Stone shattered, trees splintered. The terrain that had shielded Gondwana became a funnel of destruction. Yet the collapse was not immediate. Veer Narayan's counterattacks carved brief openings in an otherwise closing field. Leading from the front, he struck where Mughal formations thinned. Supply units, exposed infantry, cavalry regrouping after bombardment. Each assault was limited in scope and duration, designed to disrupt rather than hold. The objective was not breakthrough. It was delay. This was Gondwana's signature move in extremis. Fragment the enemy's rhythm. Force response. Withdraw before retaliation could concentrate. Against cannon, it was a losing strategy, but it was the only one that preserved agency. Durgavati coordinated these actions from the rear line, still mounted on Sarman. The elephant's height offered visibility across chaos, smoke, movement, flashes of fire. Orders were relayed continuously. Units repositioned. Retreat routes were covered. No panic spread. Discipline held. This control mattered. Battles are not only decided by weapons, but by how long coherence survives under pressure. Gondwana's forces, though reduced, did not disintegrate. They adapted minute by minute, turning annihilation into attrition. At one critical moment, Mughal cavalry attempted to encircle the remaining Gond units, aiming to sever withdrawal completely. Durgavati responded with a direct charge. Elephants advanced into the threatened flank, breaking formation and forcing the cavalry to disengage. It was a calculated risk. Elephants drew fire, but they also disrupted lines no horse could hold against. The maneuver succeeded. The encirclement failed. Gond units pulled back again, intact enough to continue fighting. This was leadership under constraint, not conquest. As the day wore on, losses accumulated. Ammunition ran low, numbers thinned, reports became grim. The battlefield no longer offered options that could alter the outcome, only choices that could shape what remained. It was at this point that Durgavati made her final command decision of the battle. She ordered a full withdrawal of all remaining units capable of movement. No further countercharges. No last stand. Survival. Where possible. This order contradicted expectation. Queens were expected to inspire sacrifice, not limit it. Durgavati did the opposite. She refused to consume her army for symbolism. Gondwana's strength was not in dying together. It was in continuing separately. Only after the withdrawal was underway did she remain exposed. Accounts differ on the exact moment. Some say she was wounded by an arrow. Others suggest a musket ball. What is consistent is that she was injured and unable to continue command. At that point, capture became imminent. Capture, in this context, meant erasure, a living trophy, a conquered ruler paraded to validate empire. Durgavati understood this rule as clearly as any Mughal officer. If she was taken alive, the meaning of her resistance would be rewritten. Autonomy would become rebellion. Defiance would become failure. The tactical battle was over. The strategic one, over memory and meaning, was not. Her final decision would not be made with troops or terrain. It would be made alone, under fire, with no possibility of reversal. By the time the firing slackened, Gondwana's army no longer existed as a formation. What remained were fragments, small groups retreating into forest paths, wounded men carried by those still standing, officers making decisions without expecting reinforcement. Around 300 were left near the field. Enough to survive, not enough to fight. Durgavati's injury removed her from command, but not from choice. The battlefield had narrowed to a single question that no advisor could answer for her. Escape was still possible. Forest routes remained open. Loyal guards were prepared to carry her away. Survival, in a biological sense, was within reach, but survival carried consequence. If she lived to be captured later, her authority would be repurposed. The Mughal system understood how to neutralize resistance without killing it. A defeated ruler, alive and displayed, became proof of imperial mercy and inevitability. Her past victories would be reclassified as disorder. Her refusal would be reframed as error. This was the internal conflict Durgavati faced. It was not between courage and fear. It was between two futures. One in which Gondwana lost a battle, another in which Gondwana lost its meaning. She had ruled long enough to understand how power reshapes narrative. Empires do not merely conquer land. They conquer interpretation. A captured queen would become an exhibit. A surviving ruler could be rewritten. Her decision followed the logic she had applied throughout her reign. Authority was not a possession. It was a function. When it could no longer be exercised in defense of sovereignty, it must not be transferred to the enemy. She refused evacuation. This refusal was not impulsive. It was consistent. From the first campaigns of her regency, she had prioritized structure over self-preservation. Soldiers were withdrawn when positions collapsed. Heirs were protected when battles turned. Individuals mattered insofar as they sustained the system. Now the system required something else. Accounts describe her final act in restrained terms. She turned her weapon inward rather than allow capture. The act was not framed as despair, but as control. The end of command, chosen rather than imposed. This choice shifted the nature of the defeat. Mughal forces had won the field, but they had not taken the ruler. There would be no procession, no declaration of submission spoken in her voice, no living symbol to neutralize Gondwana's defiance. What remained instead was absence. Absence is dangerous to empire. It cannot be paraded. It cannot be corrected. It invites memory to fill gaps with meaning beyond control. For the Gond soldiers who escaped, her death clarified their duty. Survival was no longer resistance. It was transmission. Carrying the story forward became an obligation. In this moment, power moved from battlefield to narrative, from command to memory, from a living queen to an idea that could not be captured. The Mughal victory was real, territory would fall, fortresses would burn. But the internal conflict Durgavati resolved ensured that conquest would never be total. The war for land ended at Narrai Nala. The war over what that land had stood for was only beginning. Rani Durgavati died on the 24th of June, 1564. The battle at Narrai Nala ended soon after, but its consequences spread far beyond the gorge. With her death, Gondwana lost its commander. Yet the logic of total conquest still stalled. The immediate aftermath unfolded in waves. Mughal forces advanced toward Chowraghar, the fortified seat of Gond authority. Resistance continued, all but without centralized command it could not hold indefinitely. When defeat became unavoidable, the women of the court performed jauhar, choosing death over capture. This was not spectacle. It was the final refusal to be converted into proof of subjugation. Veer Narayan did not survive long after. The young heir attempted to regroup remaining forces and defend the fort. He fell in combat, closing the line Durgavati had protected only days earlier. Gondwana's political continuity ended with him. Material losses followed quickly. The royal treasury was seized. Fortifications were dismantled. Administrative centers were absorbed into Mughal provincial structure. On paper, Gondwana became territory, mapped, taxed, managed. Yet something resisted absorption. Mughal chronicles recorded the campaign, but with restraint. Victories were noted. Resistance was acknowledged. What they did not linger on was the problem Durgavati posed. A prolonged, competent refusal by a female ruler did not fit comfortably within imperial narrative. She was described briefly, sometimes dismissed, sometimes praised, but never centered. This silence mattered. In Gond memory, the story took a different shape. Oral traditions preserved her as a warrior queen who chose death over surrender. Songs emphasized her command, not her defeat. In these accounts, Narrai was not the place she lost Gondwana. It was the place she denied empire a final word. Between imperial record and local memory, a shadow formed. Durgavati existed in fragments, named but not explained, acknowledged but not fully accounted for. Over time, this partial remembrance hardened into marginalization. She became regional rather than central, exceptional rather than instructive. This was not accidental. History tends to compress what challenges its organizing logic. Empires prefer clean arcs: resistance, defeat, incorporation. Durgavati disrupted that arc by making defeat incomplete. Her authority ended on her terms, not the empire's. The accusation of failure that followed misses the point. Gondwana was conquered in territory, not in legitimacy. The Mughal state expanded, but it did not convert her into submission. That distinction mattered to those who remembered. In the centuries that followed, Gondwana's forests were mapped and exploited. Its resources flowed outward. Its political autonomy disappeared. But the memory of Durgavati persisted in forms that resisted administrative erasure. She did not rule long enough to found a dynasty that endured. She ruled long enough to demonstrate that sovereignty could be defended without permission, even when it could not be preserved. The shadow of Narrai Nala stretches beyond defeat. It marks the boundary between conquest and control, between taking land and owning meaning. That boundary is where her story remains. Rani Durgavati's legacy did not travel through palaces or imperial archives. It moved through quieter channels. Mughal records mentioned her only in passing, as a problem resolved, a region subdued. In those texts, her name sits at the edge of campaigns, never at their center. Empire recorded outcome, not challenge. Among the Gond people, memory followed a different route. Songs and oral histories preserved her not as a defeated ruler, but as a measure of sovereignty. She became the standard against which later losses were understood. Her story was not about survival. It was about refusal. Centuries later, fragments resurfaced in public form. Statues rose. Universities, districts, and institutions took her name. An Indian naval ship was christened in her honor. Each gesture attempted to pull her back into the national narrative. though often without confronting why she had been absent for so long. Her legacy forms a chain: imperial omission, local remembrance, modern recovery. Each link reflects a choice about what kind of power deserves to be remembered. Durgavati did not ask permission to rule. She did not ask mercy to surrender. She governed, fought, and decided as a sovereign. And when sovereignty could no longer be exercised on the battlefield, she withdrew it from her enemy's reach. Her death was not an end, but a limit imposed on conquest. This is why her story matters. Not because she won every battle, but because she defined what loss would mean. Gondwana fell as territory. It did not fall as an idea. If she had survived Narrai Nala only to be paraded in chains, would Gondwana still exist in Indian memory today? Or was it her refusal to be possessed, alive or dead, that ensured she could not be erased? That question remains, and so does she.